Now, I've got to come back to this, how so many journalists are dangerously ignorant about what is really driving this war against Israel, how they are useful idiots now for Jew haters and one of the nastiest fascist regimes in the world, playing them for fools. These are journalists who think Israel is to blame for having Islamist terrorists in Gaza firing more than 3,000 rockets at it. And they think it's all started just because, I don't know, some Jewish landlords in East Jerusalem are trying to evict 6 Palestinian families who, by the way, were refusing to pay their rent. That's what that's about. How stupid, though, do you have to be to think that that court case is why Israel's now being hit with 3,000 rockets? And any journalist should get a hint of the truth about this just from the anti-Israel protests alone that we are seeing around the world. I mean, I showed you last night some, including a convoy of Palestinian supporters in London shouting on megaphones that Jewish mothers and girls should be raped. Now, new footage from Belgium. Muslims chanting, Kaiba, Kaiba, Ya Yehud, which means Jews remember Kaiba. It's a battle where Muhammad slaughtered a Jewish tribe. It's a traditional call to kill Jews. London, the same chant, Kaiba, Kaiba, Ya Yehud, and Jaish Muhammad, Sauf Yahud. Muhammad's army is returning. Now, let me be kind to many protesters of the left. I'm a kind guy. Maybe they don't realise that they're just backing an ancient Jew hatred, a religious war, a call to slaughter, or maybe they don't realise that Islam isn't much more tolerant of their own causes either. I mean, you witnessed the surprise of a gay rights activist in Amsterdam who was wanting to join an anti-Israel protest when he was told that he and his flag weren't actually welcome. And check what happened to a Muslim blogger in Birmingham in Britain when Palestinian protesters thought that he wasn't supporting them. They smashed into his house.
This is for that dirty dog, Abu Layth, who disrespect our brothers and sisters of Palestine. Yeah.
Now, for the casual leftist protester, I do get their ignorance, but journalists, I think, have no excuse because it is their responsibility to work out what is really going on. And they should know that this isn't really about a few houses in East Jerusalem. This is an uprising that Iran, the fascist Islamist regime, has been planning for months, if not longer. Iran has been paying the Hamas terrorist group that runs Gaza $30 million US every month. And a year ago, the deputy head of Hamas said, yes, indeed, Iran is supporting us, and watch out for another intifada, an uprising, a war to wipe out Israel, which he hates so much that he can't even name it. He just calls Israel the entity.
أعتقد أن الأمر ممكن جدا وقد يكون أقرب مما يتصور الناس. إحنا موقفنا يعني لا يحتمل المساومة. يعني لو عرض علينا الاعتراف بالكيان على نصف فلسطين ونأخذ نصفها لا نقبل هذه المساومة.
That's right. You heard it. Hamas does not want any compromise or any deal. It wants the entire of Israel dead and buried. Now, Iran is also funding and sending experts to another Islamist group that's firing rockets at Israel. Here's the senior leader of that group, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad.
السلاح الإيراني هو الذي يضرب به المجاهدون في غزة العدو الصهيوني ويضرب به المجاهدون في لبنان العدو الصهيوني. المال الإيراني هو الذي نذخر به أنفسنا. الخبرات الإيرانية هي التي تقوم بالإشراف على جزء مهم من العمل.
So let me underline a point that no journalists, very few, seem to be getting. Iran does not want peace with Israel. I've shown you before tweets from its supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, saying he wants Israel gone and all Muslims have a responsibility to fight it. And one of Iran's generals just 2 weeks ago showed how insane this hatred is, blaming Jews for creating not just the Islamic State, but the Freemasons, saying the country of these wicked Jews must be destroyed.
جنایات اسرائیل زیاده. قتل عام مردم فلسطین از ابتدای تشکیل حکومتشون خلق وهابیت، خلق بهائیت، خلق جریان‌های فراماسونری و تولد داعش همه جزء راهبردهای اساسی صهیونیسم بین الملل بوده. ایفتاریم بر علیه اسرائیل و نابودی اسرائیل.
Now, this is what's going on and what you have not heard on your ABC. Jew-hating terrorists, mullahs, generals, backed by Iran in a war to destroy Israel. But watch the fools in newspaper offices here and TV and radio studios saying, oh, this war is just about these few houses in Jerusalem and Israel should negotiate with these people. And excuse me, what is there to negotiate with people who want you dead? Joining me earlier was Greg Sheridan, Foreign Affairs writer with The Australian. I think the best Foreign Affairs writer in the country. Greg Sheridan, thank you so much for joining me. I've already established that Iran is playing a key role in this violence. You in The Australian today blame new US President Joe Biden for letting Iran off the leash. Why is that?
Well, Andrew, I think Biden has been strong and successful on China, but he's been weak and disastrous on the Middle East. He's tried to undo everything that Donald Trump did, and Donald Trump was very successful in the Middle East. So Biden is chasing a resurrection of the terrible deal that Barack Obama did with Iran, which basically let them off the hook in terms of their nuclear program. And as a result of that, all the steam has gone out of the old Trump sanctions regime. So Iran has much more diplomatic and economic and political space than it had under Trump. It signed a big long-term multi-decade investment deal with China. Iran is orchestrating what's happening in the Gaza Strip. And when Trump gave such absolute backing to Israel, there was not much incentive in trying to discredit Israel and get it punished in multilateral organizations, because you knew the Americans were going to stand by it 1,000,000%. But now with Biden's support for Israel far more equivocal, the people who hate Israel have an incentive to try to bring it to discredit again in international organizations. Similarly, Biden is much less committed to the security of the Gulf Arab states than Trump was, and so their incentives to make peace with Israel are diminished. And of course, just ask yourself, how has the Biden process worked? He's restored $230 million of aid money to the Palestinians in order to get more American influence with them. And the result has been that Mahmoud Abbas, who's in his 17th year of a 4-year term as Palestinian president, has postponed elections indefinitely, and Hamas has fired 3,000 rockets at Israel. So if that's a success, I tell you what, if Donald Trump's policies had produced that outcome, there'd be no end of condemnation of him.
Well, let's draw this contrast. You mentioned that Donald Trump's policies in the Middle East, and your column is very good on, very strong on this point. Policies in the Middle East were actually quite successful. Can you tell us what they were and what outcomes he got?
Well, that's right, Andrew. He recognised that Iran was the enemy of every good instinct in the Middle East, and he gave absolute backing to Israel, and he told the Palestinians that terrorism and rejectionism against Israel was not going to cut any mustard with him. And in fact, he moved the US embassy to Jerusalem and made his absolute solidarity with Israel utterly clear. So this set up a series of incentives and disincentives for good behaviour and bad behaviour in the Middle East. The Gulf states recognised Iran as their common enemy. They recognised Israel as a tremendous partner in this security challenge. And they were happy to make peace with Israel because this was comprehensively underwritten by Trump, who was going to support them, support Israel, and support their peace agreement. So Trump secured 4 peace agreements in the Middle East with 2 Gulf states and with Sudan and Morocco on the one hand, and with Israel as their partner. That's an incredible achievement. The Palestinians began to realise that time was not on their side and that their old tactics of rejectionism and terrorism against Israel were unavailing. And the Iranians were boxed in by Trump's aggressive sanctions and political opposition. Now, all of that has unravelled. Joe Biden has unravelled all of that within 3 months.
Now, Biden obviously put feelers out to Iran, made noises about easing the sanctions of the just talk about the nuclear program. He, as you say, restored funding to the Palestinians that Donald Trump froze. That's $230 million US, 300 million Australian a year. And let's not forget, he was also vice president when Barack Obama gave more than $2 billion in cash to buy peace and release hostages, gave Iran that money, and also freed up nearly $200 billion more in frozen Iranian assets. I'm just wondering, Greg, is it too ungenerous to suspect that all this money handed over by Obama and Biden to Iran and to the Palestinians has helped to pay for the missiles that are now falling on Israel?
Yes, I think that's a perfectly legitimate connection to make, Andrew. Iran has a much more economic power and much more political space under Biden than it had under Trump. The Palestinians have a lot more money. Now, what Hamas is doing to its own people in Gaza is absolutely terrible. The innocent women and children and civilians in Gaza are truly innocent. And the people who have encompassed their death and destruction is the Hamas terrorist group, which tyrannises them. This is not a democratic body in any way, and it is hand in glove with the Iranians. It's really a puppet of the Iranians. It's connected with the Muslim Brotherhood. It's committed to the total destruction of Israel. As you pointed out on your program, it doesn't regard occupied territory as the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It regards Israel proper as occupied territory. Its charter is full of anti-Semitic tropes. It hates Jews and it hates Israelis. And it is working intimately with the Iranians. Now, both Hamas and the Iranians have been empowered by actions which Barack Obama took 4 years ago, more than 4 years ago, and actions which Joe Biden has taken. Now, Biden doesn't hate Israel or anything. There's nothing like that. America is still giving support to Israel, but it is much more qualified and limited support. And in trying to appease the Iranians and the Palestinian extremists in order to gain their cooperation, he just empowers them, in my view anyway.
Greg, I've actually run out of time, but I've got to ask you this. Joe Biden said at the start of this conflict, Israel has the right to defend itself. And as you point out, he's still offering some support. But he is also now telling Israel he wants a ceasefire and has sent over his top Middle East advisor, Hadi Amr, to get one. Now, Amr is a Muslim born in Lebanon who once wrote that he was inspired by the Palestinian Intifada. What signals does this send?
Well, the Biden presidency approaches the Democratic Party like an indulgent grandfather at a Christmas party. Every faction gets a toy. And one of the toys that the left got in the Democratic Party was the appointment of a whole lot of anti-Israel people to the Middle East desk. Now, I'm glad that Biden is getting China right. I'd rather he gets China right and the Middle East wrong than the other way around. But one reason the extremists are emboldened in the Middle East is because Biden appointed so many anti-Israel people to his administration. And, you know, you cannot just call for a ceasefire. For a start, Hamas hasn't stopped firing its rockets. But secondly, if Israel simply stops and starts every time Hamas stops and starts without achieving clear military objectives, that gives Hamas absolute power to turn this whole business on and off like a tap. Now, I tell you, Andrew, and I believe you'd agree with this, no nation in the world would accept 3,000 rockets raining down on its cities. Imagine if that was happening in Sydney or Melbourne. We would respond with extreme vigour. So I do think there is something sort of simplistic and, unbalanced about Biden's, bland call for a ceasefire. Of course, everybody hopes the violence stops. But for the violence to stop in any sustainable way, Hamas has got to forswear the terrorism, which is actually at the core of its being.
Greg Sheridan, it's just an awful mess, and I tremble that Joe Biden is trying to meddle with it. Thank you so much for your time.
Great to talk to you, Andrew. Thank you.